and
I did a
number
little test to see if the stone would fit in there. It did perfectly. The next job was then was to make the backing plate. So I just sanded down the bezel strip to make sure that the edges were flat, and then I took a piece of sterling silver sheet, 0.7mm thick, and I just cut away like a rectangle big enough to accommodate my stone. And then I had the pleasure of removing the plastic cover from the silver sheet, which is probably a bit too naughty to show in this video. The second soldering job in making this silver pendant was to solder the bezel wire to the backing plate. So I put a liberal amount of flux onto the backing plate and then placed a good few pieces of easy silver solder kind of on the inside of the bezel wire. I proceeded to use one torch to kind of heat up the piece and kind of make sure that everything was still aligned. And then I got two torches out to kind of bring the solder up to a heat where it would run. Now, sensible silversmiths, like Go Meow Creations, would have used some kind of tripod or a piece of mesh so they could heat the piece from underneath, but I don't have one, so I just used my soldering block. Anyway, it worked. When it came out, it looked like it had been in a swamp, but after a little pickling, it turned out pretty nice. Now, the edges of the bezel wire were a bit too tall for my cabochon stone, so I just used some 180 grit emery paper to kind of sand down the height of the bezel wire. And with that done, I used my jeweler's saw to kind of cut off the excess silver from the outside edges of the bezel. I have to go in turbo mode with the saw and cutting away kind of all the waste material. Instead of using a file, I just used a fine sandpaper grit on the disc sander on my lathe. I mean, mainly just because I wanted to get the video done quickly, but it worked just fine. I just kind of sanded away really gently and easily until the backing plate was flush with the edges of that bezel. And then I took a few grits of emery paper and just kind of did a little bit more kind of fine sanding, just trying to get rid of any tooling marks and just make it a bit more presentable before I kind of soldered on the bail. So speaking of the bail, I had a teeny tiny silver bail. The end of the bail was pointed, so before I could solder that onto the piece, I flattened that off with a piece of sandpaper, just to make a little flat spot where the bail would be soldered to the pendant. And I also used a file to make a flat spot on the actual bit of the pendant as well. And then I just used some easy solder to solder the bail onto the pendant. So after a quick quenching and a pickling, it was time to finally put my stone in to the bezel. So I used a piece of blue tack on my bench to hold it in place, squished the stone in, and then I used one of these tools, which is called a bezel rocker, to push the fine silver bezel wire kind of over the edges of the stone to hold it in place. And the trick with this is you can come from kind of opposite sides. So if you imagine the stone was a clock, you'd start at like 12 o'clock and then push in a little piece, go to 6, push in a piece, go to 3, push in a piece, go to 9, push in a piece, and just work your way around the clock. And when I kind of roughly pushed all of the edges of that bezel wire over the stone, I used a couple of burnishing tools to further kind of smooth the edges of that wire over the stone. And this actually gave a semi-nice finish to that bezel wire as well. So I love this process because there's no glue involved, it's all kind of like mechanical fit, and it's really a satisfying process. So after I'd squished the edges over, I used a couple of files and some sandpaper to go over the whole piece just to kind of give it a nice, smooth pre-finish before moving on to polishing. So I did this with various grits of emery paper, working up to like a 2000 grit, just to make sure that there were no nasty tooling marks and it was all looking presentable. And then I moved on to a buffing wheel on a rotary tool, and I actually used 2 polishing compounds to polish up the silver. So I started out with Tripoli, which is the brown polishing compound, and then finally used Rouge, which is the red polishing compound. And in between polishing compounds, I cleaned the piece off in an ultrasonic cleaner. So with my polishing done, that was the whole process complete.